This past week, I had the opportunity to spend the week with a group of our high school students at this big conference called CIY, which stands for Christ in Youth. We had a really great time there. A lot of good bonding moments, but also we received a pretty big challenge from the theme of the week, which was "This changes everything," and this being the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. And during the week, I shared with the students a story. When I was a student at Atlanta Christian College, I had a friend, a roommate, whose grandfather became sick and sadly passed away. And so, wanting to support my friend, I decided that I would go to the funeral. And so I go to the funeral, and during it, this crazy thing happens. All of a sudden, his grandfather sits up in the casket, and he throws his arms and his legs over the side of the casket, and he stands up and he starts to walk around, and he starts to talk to everyone. And the students are like, "No way, that didn't happen, you're lying, that can't be." And of course it didn't happen, I made it up. But the fact is, something like that did happen. Our faith is based on the fact that something like that happened. They said, "No, that couldn't have happened, you're lying," because dead people stay dead. And we know that dead people stay dead. They don't come back to life. But Jesus did. Jesus died, and he did not stay dead. And this changes everything. Throughout the week, we looked at the book of James, and James was one of Jesus' brothers, not the disciple James, but a brother of Jesus. And he wrote this letter to a church about the resurrection of Jesus. And though when you look through James, you don't really see much about the resurrection, you know that James would not have written this letter if the resurrection had not happened. If you look in the Gospels, you see a couple of stories where Jesus is teaching, and you find Jesus' family come and try to stop him. And they're saying, "Jesus, what are you saying? You're saying things we've never heard before. You don't really look like this Messiah that we've been expecting. You're not defeating Rome, giving us freedom, overthrowing our oppressors. What you're saying sounds kind of strange. So Jesus, why don't you just come on home? Just stop and come on home." And James is one of those people. He was Jesus' family. And it's strange that if Jesus had not been risen from the dead, if James had not seen the risen Christ, it's strange that James would have become a leader in the church in Jerusalem. It's strange that later on he would have been willing to die for his faith, which happened. James was martyred because he believed in Jesus. And though it's not necessarily stated in James, it's all throughout. It's the very reason James writes what he does, is to tell people that Jesus rose from the dead, and because of that, something needs to change. Something has changed. But the way you live, the way you interact with each other, needs to change. My favorite resurrection narrative is found in Mark 16. I'm going to read it to you, beginning in verse 1. "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go anoint Jesus' body." So that was something customary for people to do, to delay the decomposition, to kind of cover the stench. People would go and cover corpses with all these spices, and so that's what these women are doing. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb when they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" And that's a good question, because the stone was really large, not something that just a couple of people could roll away, especially this group of women. Nothing against women. Sorry if it sounded like that. That was not my intent. But they're wondering, how are we going to move this stone? And they know that there's Roman soldiers there guarding the tomb, and maybe they're thinking, maybe these soldiers will be nice and roll it away for us. Maybe they're arguing which one's going to bat their eyes and kind of flirt with the guards. I don't know what they're thinking, but they do know that if we want to do this, the stone has to be moved. But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The initial response to the resurrection was one of fear. And that's the natural response, because dead people stay dead. What they're encountering right now is something like out of a horror story. Ghosts or zombies. Bad things are things that come up from the grave. And their natural response was one of fear. That was the first response to the resurrection. And they were afraid. And if you notice between verses 8 and 9, you might see a note, or maybe there's a footnote that says, "The earliest manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16 verses 9 through 20. That's there because there's this principle that the earlier something is written, the more reliable it is, the more trustworthy it is. And so this note says that the earliest copies of Mark that are found do not have those verses. And I wasn't there. I can't verify if Mark wrote this or not. But to kind of explain what that means in detail, if you were to go out of here after I preach and to talk about the sermon, you would probably remember a lot of it. You'd have more to talk about than if you were to get together in a week and try to talk about the sermon. Or in a few years even, you might remember that I said something about the resurrection, but you probably wouldn't remember much about what I said. So a lot of scholars think Mark didn't write these last few verses, that some scribe later on kind of tacked this on to give it a nice, clean ending, because otherwise the last word would be afraid. And that's kind of a strange way to end a gospel about hope and a gospel about love, and something that's supposed to be good and happy. Mark would have ended with this idea of being afraid. And even if Mark did write verses 9 through 20, you still see several times where he uses the word afraid or a synonym of it: trembling, bewildered. Do not be alarmed, the angel tells them, because they are alarmed. Dead people stay dead, but Jesus didn't. And that was scary to them. What does that mean to these women? What do we do with this? How do we process this? During CIY, a couple of the speakers got up one evening and talked about what we do with this, how we process it. And they gave examples of just different categories that kind of describe our lives and how the resurrection of Jesus changed those things. For example, they talked about health care and how in the centuries after Jesus' resurrection, it became almost mandatory for churches to have a room in the church called a hospitality room, where those who were sick or hurting could go and receive treatment and care. And over time, that developed into kind of our modern day hospitals. We have these hospitals today because of what Jesus did and how he took care of people, and how the church wanted to take care of people like Jesus did. Another category they brought up was art, and how if you were to take any piece of art, the content, whose content was about Jesus or his disciples or the church, that you'd be left with less than half of the art in the world. They even talked about sports and how Jesus has changed sports. And they told the story of Jackie Robinson in 1948 trying to break the racial barrier in Major League Baseball, and how there was a team executive for the Brooklyn Dodgers named Branch Rickey, who was a devout Christian, and he didn't think that the color of your skin should determine whether or not you can play Major League Baseball. And he called Jackie Robinson into his office, and he read from him where Jesus says, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. And he looks at Jackie Robinson and says, "Can you do this?" And Jackie Robinson says, "Yes, sir." And because of that, he made history and he changed sports. Or even the NFL draft. It was kind of put in place by a man who was a Christian, one of the owners for one of the NFL teams. And The principle is based on the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And even today, the worst teams in NFL, the following draft, they draft first. And so Jesus has even changed sports, and that might seem more of a trivial matter, but he's changed everything from science, geography, relationships, and the way different classes interact with one another. Everything has been affected by the resurrection. So one of the things that this past week forced me and the rest of us who went to think about was, have I been changed by the resurrection? And what does the resurrection mean for me? What do I believe about the resurrection? And so I was forced to think about this, and I shared with the students why I believed in the resurrection. And growing up, I wouldn't have said this then, but looking back, I believed in the resurrection because my parents believed in the resurrection. I was a Christian because I was born in a Christian home, and that's what you did in my home. You became a Christian. It wasn't necessarily forced upon us, but we weren't really presented with an option either. And because of this, I was a good kid growing up. In middle and high school, I was a good kid. I never really did anything wrong. The students asked me this morning if I ever had a wild period in my life, and I didn't. And I owe that to my family, that support system, to my youth group going up. For that support system, they were there for me. And if you would have asked me how to define a Christian, what does a Christian do, when I entered Atlanta Christian College as a freshman, I would have said something like this. A Christian is someone who does not cuss, does not drink, and votes Republican. And some of you may think that. I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything, but I'm saying that's not a good definition for a Christian. That's not a good definition for what it means to be a Christian. But when I was at Atlanta Christian College, I met people who defined Christianity different and who had different values. And I didn't have my family there. I didn't have my youth group there. And so I started to question my faith. I started to wonder why I believe these things. Why do I think this way? Why do I believe this? And so I actually got to a point one evening I was studying for a quiz over the books of Luke and John in one of my classes. And I'm sitting in my dorm room in the Coke machine room, and the light from the Coke machines kind of just shining on me. That's how I'm reading. And I'm reading things that don't make sense to me, and a lot of things that sound kind of strange that Jesus was saying. And I made this conclusion, and I whispered these words: I do not believe that God exists. And in that moment, I believed it. In that moment, there was no God to me. And suddenly everything went black, and I never felt so cold or alone or terrified or dark in my entire life. And I knew that something was gone, something I'd always had left. And I knew I was wrong. I immediately changed my mind. That moment kind of verified, for me at least, the fact that God exists, the fact that the resurrection was real. But even after that moment, I would still have questions. And I would have questions about God and even doubts. But I learned how to use those questions and doubts to build up my faith instead of destroy it like it had. When I think about, is the resurrection real, or why do I believe it, I kind of have to ask two questions and answer two separate questions. The first one being, why did I become a Christian? And that answer is because my family, they were Christians. I wanted to take communion with the church. That's why I became a Christian. But the more important question to me has been, why did I stay a Christian? And it's because of moments I've had with God like that. It's because of moments I've had with other people where I can see the power of God in their lives, where I can experience the love of God through other people. I stay a Christian because of the church and of what the church can do, who the church can be. Because there's nothing like the power of God, and to experience that through someone else verifies in my mind, in my life, the reality of God. And I see the same power that God used to raise Jesus from the dead at work in other people's lives and at work in my life. And I know that it's real. One of the speakers this past week kept repeating this statement. We are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. We are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. And the more I thought about it, the more that statement kind of contradicted itself, because Good Friday happened before Easter. But then, the more I tried to make sense of that, it did make sense. That this world, even though the resurrection has happened, there's a lot of things that still need to take place. There are a lot of people who don't know that. There are a lot of hurts and needs in this world that need to be met. And we are a resurrected people who not just believe in the resurrection, but have experienced in our lives. And because we have experienced that, because we're kind of carrying Jesus' resurrection around in us, we can offer it to other people, and we can meet people's needs. The power of God can be displayed through our lives as well. And this speaker gave an example of an Easter person living in a Good Friday world. He told the story about his 5-year-old son one night who came to him and said, "Daddy, I have a dream. I think there are people in Africa who need shoes, and I want to take shoes to people in Africa." And his dad was like, "It's late, just go back to bed. That's a good dream, but just go back to bed." And the next night his son comes to him and says, "Dad, there's this country called Ghana in Africa, and there are people there are kids there who need shoes." And his dad started listening to him then, and over the next couple of weeks, this kid actually meets another kid who has a similar dream, that he wants to go to Africa and do something. And so they start figuring out what this might look like. And over the next year, they collect hundreds and hundreds of shoes. And when they're 6 years old, these two boys go to Africa, and these kids are lining up, and they have this bucket there, and they're washing these children's feet, and they're handing them shoes and putting the shoes on their feet. And it was just a beautiful and inspiring story of what it means to be an Easter people living in a Good Friday world. These students were also challenged this week to acknowledge that they are not too young to do something for Christ. They're not too young to do something for His kingdom. Just like the 6-year-old boy who went to Africa. They weren't too young. And so we came to grips with the fact that, in a sense, this world is still a Good Friday world, but it does not have to be because of the resurrection. And these students, they want that known. And they want to live a resurrected life. And so I'm going to ask them to come up here. The high schoolers who went to CIY this week. None of them want to do this, just so you know. But they're going to because I'm making them. So thank y'all for coming up here. And I know most of them aren't going to say much, but they are at least going to say thank you. And there are a couple who are going to share a little bit about their experience. So, Owen, sorry that you got stuck over there, but you're going first.
Thank you for letting us get support us.
Thank you all for letting us do it. It really means a lot to me.
So apparently Josh talked me into sharing my experience with all of you. I don't know how. But what was really challenging to me was, in James, he says we have to control our tongues. And we had a video of a tongue and a heart. It was animated, but at the end of it, it says, "Do not let your tongue destroy an entire city." That as Christians, we are supposed to be the ones building each other up and not tearing down this body of Christ. And we're supposed to work through our differences, and that really hit me.
Thank you, Kennedy.
Thank you all for letting us go to see our live this week. It really meant a lot, and it really helped me become a better Christian.
Thank you.
thank y'all for supporting us together. It was just an amazing week. We all learned a lot and grew closer together. And just very impressive.
Thank you for allowing us to go, and this week has been very memorable for me. It was my first time being in CLI, and I had a lot of fun. And I got to make new friends and bonded with people I had known my life, but not as well as I thought I did. So, but it was just a really great time. And,
Hey, thank y'all for doing this. I know that I remember being y'all's age and having to do something like this too, and how uncomfortable it is. But y'all done a great job. Thank you. And they're going to stay up here for just a few more minutes because I need them for something else. But these students this past week, I mean, I really think that they got it, that they understood the theme of the week and what that means for them. They want to live a resurrected life. And one of the beautiful things that I love about baptism is kind of the symbolism behind it. I don't think it's just a symbolic event, but I do appreciate the symbolism of when you're baptized into Christ and you go under the water. It's kind of like you're entering a grave. And when you come back out, it's kind of like you're being raised from the dead with Jesus. And we live in a Good Friday world, but we're Easter people. We are a resurrected people. And God is at work in our lives, transforming us into His likeness, into who He intended us to be from the very beginning. And this process isn't complete until the resurrection. And one day Jesus is going to return, and He's going to raise the dead, and we all, like Jesus, are going to receive a new and glorious and physical resurrected body. And that will be when all of this is completed, when our resurrection process in a way will be completed. But right now we live as though that's already happened, and we share that with the world. CIY has a term that they call kingdom workers, and a kingdom worker describes, or should describe, a Christian, a follower of Christ. But it's someone who does work for God's kingdom and makes an impact in their lives, like the 6-year-old boy and his friend who went to Ghana with shoes. They are kingdom workers. And this past week we received several testimonies and watched several videos of high schoolers who had done kingdom work, who are kingdom workers. And anyway, we all received one of these cards, everyone who went. And these are called kingdom worker cards. And this is what mine said. And each one of these students got one, and it's a challenge for them. Over the next 6 months, make a concerted effort to keep from saying anything negative or cutting about anyone. Try to compliment 10 people each day. Ask a friend to keep you accountable. And when I received this and read it to the students, they said, "Josh, that's not fair. You don't say anything negative about anyone." And honestly, I feel like I do a pretty good job with that. But try to compliment 10 people each day, that's a lot harder in my mind. Not just the fact that I'm having to find something nice about someone, but there are days when I don't even see 10 different people. I might see Jim, maybe Clarice will come, or Phil or Mary will come into the office, and I'll see my family. And, that's not 10 right there, but I probably can't do the same 10 every day either. So this is going to be hard for me. Naturally, I'm more of a reserved person, but I have to go and find 10 people every day. And honestly, I did not do this yesterday. It was our second day, and I've already, failed with this. And so I think it would be really neat if we as a church could kind of embrace this spirit also. And I'm going to have the students read their kingdom cards and make note of some of them. Make a note to pray for them or to write encouraging notes to them about these kingdom cards, so that we can, as a church, as a unified body, build each other up and support each other. So, Owen, you want to start again?
Mine was research yourself with justice and raise support for it.
Mine is learn about a missionary and your church supports. Ask them how you can raise awareness and help them at your church.
Mine was help out a special needs school or ministry for 6 months.
Don't listen to any music in your car or wherever you listen to music for 2 months, and instead spend that time in prayer for your friends, church, and family.
Volunteer an hour a week for 6 months to a special needs group in the area.
Mine was read through the Bible and then talk about what was here.
Mine was share my testimony with 5 people that have share theirs.
Thank y'all. Hey, can we give them a hand for being brave? Y'all can go have a seat. Y'all can go have a seat. And one of the students who can't be here this morning, Maggie, actually, her Kingdom card was to spend spring break this upcoming year on a mission trip. And, there's a reason she can't be here this morning, but I did want to let you know that, because sometimes being a kingdom worker means not saying something negative about someone or complimenting someone, and sometimes it means going way out of your comfort zone, maybe even on a mission trip, or giving up spring break. And not just spring break, but there are missionaries, missionaries we support who give up their lives too to go and do something for God. And so, there's different levels that this happens on, but I appreciate these students and their willingness to get up here for their authenticity with you and sharing with you. And, I'm praying for them every day that they do this, but also for this church, that we can all join them in being kingdom workers for this. I want to just end by saying that I hope that each of us asks ourselves, why do I believe in the resurrection, and what does it mean for me, and how can I live a resurrected life? And if there's anyone here this morning who wants to make that decision to be baptized into Christ, to experience the power of the resurrection in their own lives, and to help others experience that same power, then I invite you to come forward. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation this morning. And so this invitation is always standing, but right now, if you want to make that decision, we invite you to come forward.
Everybody, Psalm 521, burdens are lifted at Calvary. Let's all stand and sing verses 1 and 3. Days are filled with sorrow and care. Hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near. Troubled soul, the Savior